At 2:01 a.m., the world doesn't look real. It looks like silhouettes and sound, the thump of rotors, the flash of floodlights, and a single moment where a government realizes it can pay its bills with promises anymore, so it reaches for something physical. In early January 2026, reports and leaks began circulating that U.S. forces executed a rapid operation in Caracas, and that Venezuela AS leadership was removed from power within hours. If this scenario is accurate, it won't be remembered as a headline. It will be remembered as a signal. Because when an empire approaches the edge of its monetary limits, it stops speaking the language of diplomacy and starts speaking the language of resources. This isn't about politics. This is about mathematics. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Over the last 2,000 years, the world has watched the same cycle repeat with different flags, different technology, and different excuses. The mechanism stays identical. Sound money becomes expansion. Expansion becomes overreach. Overreach becomes debasement. Debasement becomes desperate asset grabs. Asset grabs become loss of confidence. Loss of confidence becomes fiscal dominance. And fiscal dominance ends the same way every time. A reset that transfers wealth from people who trust the system to people who understand the system. Think about what the biggest wealth transfer really means. It does not mean someone gets rich overnight. It means the measuring stick breaks. When the unit you store your life in, your currency, your bonds, your pension claims, starts dissolving, anything measured in that unit collapses with it. And anything outside that unit, hard assets, scarce commodities, productive land, energy infrastructure, strategic metals, skills, reprices higher, not because it changed, but because the currency changed. That's the transfer. Quiet at first, then violent. Over the next hour, I am going to give you the framework that explains why a Venezuela shock matters far beyond Venezuela. We'll walk through a 7-stage empire cycle, prove it with history, then map it onto modern America with indicators you can actually watch. No politics, no tribal talking points, just the cycle. And by the end, you will know exactly what kind of world you start past moving into and what kinds of assets tend to survive it. Quick disclaimer before we go deeper. This is education and historical analysis, not financial advice. I'm not telling you what to buy. I'm showing you what cycles look like when they're already in motion. Now, let's define the cycle. The 7 stages of empire decline and wealth transfer. Stage 1, sound money foundation. This is when a currency is trusted because it's tied to something real, gold, silver, or strict constraints that prevent abuse. Trust creates trade, trade creates capital, capital creates innovation and real productivity. Stage 2, expansion and social promise. The empire builds roads, programs, infrastructure, institutions. The average citizen feels wealth rising because it is funded by the surplus of Stage 1. Stage 3, overreach and debasement. The empire's commitments grow faster than its productive base. Military projection, global policing, entitlements, debt servicing, political bargaining. The math stops working. So instead of cutting promises, the empire changes the money. In ancient times, they shaved silver from coins. In modern times, they print credit into existence. Stage 4, desperate resource acquisition. This is the acceleration phase. The empire senses the currency's credibility slipping. So it reaches for hard assets. Oil, minerals, strategic supply chains, anything that can be controlled, collateralized, or used to prop up the illusion. Stage 5, loss of confidence. This is when normal people feel it. Savings don't hold value. Costs outrun wages. The middle class fractures. Capital migrates quietly at first, then visibly. Stage 6, fiscal dominance. The debt becomes so large that monetary policy becomes hostage. The central bank can't raise rates without breaking the government. The government can't cut spending without breaking society. So inflation becomes the path of least resistance. Stage 7, reset. Collapse, default, hyperinflation, restructuring, different costumes, same outcome. The measuring stick breaks, wealth transfers. Those holding the dying unit get diluted. Those holding scarce real assets reprice higher. That's the cycle. If a Venezuela event is real, it fits Stage 4 behavior perfectly. Acquiring real assets when the system U.S. financial foundation is weakening. But we don't have to argue about one operation to see the broader reality, because the stage markers are visible in plain sight. Ballooning debt, rising interest burden, polarized politics, and accelerating capital migration. So now we do what serious analysts do. We prove the pattern with history first, then apply it today. The Roman Empire is the cleanest blueprint because it ran the full experiment over centuries and left receipts in metal content and price behavior. Rome's early strength was not just legions, it was trust. The denarius functioned as reliable money across a vast trade network. When a currency is trusted, commerce expands without friction. And when commerce expands, real wealth accumulates. But Rome did what every empire does when it grows too confident. It expanded commitments faster than production. Military costs rose. Endless frontiers needed endless defense. Bureaucracy grew. The welfare of the city, the bread distributions, the public works became politically necessary. Then came the moment that defines stage 3, debasement. Rome didn't announce it. They didn't say, "We're weakening the money." They said nothing. They simply reduced silver content, slowly at first, then faster as the pressure increased. This is where people get confused. They think debasement is a scam. It's not a scam. It's a policy choice made under constraint. Debasement is what happens when an empire refuses to break promises but runs out of honest funding. As the coin's silver content fell, prices rose. Not instantly, but progressively. Trust eroded gradually. Foreign merchants demanded more coins for the same goods. Soldiers demanded higher pay because their wages bought less. The state responded by minting more, because that's what states do when the money breaks. They accelerate the process that caused the break. Then, the empire hits stage 4 behavior. When Rome could no longer fund itself smoothly, it reached for external resources. It squeezed provinces. It extracted harder. It increased taxation. It intensified control. The story always sounds like security or stability, but underneath it's about funding the machine. Then comes stage 5, loss of confidence. This isn't a newspaper event, it's a lived experience. Bread costs more. Rent rises faster than wages. Savings buy less. Political tension becomes chronic. Then stage 6, fiscal dominance in ancient form, where the state's obligations dominate the economy. Monetary policy becomes keep the system alive at any cost. And finally, the reset. The Western Roman Empire didn't end in one day. It hollowed out. Trade shrank. Specialization collapsed. People reverted to local self-sufficiency because the monetary network stopped functioning at scale. And that is the wealth transfer in its purest form. Those who held claims on the system, paper promises, coin hoards of debased currency, were diluted into irrelevance. Those who held real assets, productive land, food production tools, durable wealth, retained power. Important lesson, the wealth transfer is not a magic profit event. It's a consequence of the money losing integrity. Now jump forward. The Dutch, the British, different centuries, same stages. The Dutch guilder rose on trade credibility and financial innovation. Stage 1 and 2 were glorious. Then overextension and war costs hit. Stage 3 debasement came through debt expansion and credit stress. Stage 4 manifested through colonial competition and resource control. Stage 5 appeared as internal instability and capital flight. Stage 6 as debt burdens and loss of monetary flexibility. Stage 7 as reserve status transition away from the guilder toward the pound. The British then repeated the full cycle on a larger scale. They dominated trade, held reserve currency status, and financed an empire. But the cost of 2 world wars and global commitments exceeded the productive base. The gold standard broke. Debt piled up. Reserve status transitioned to the dollar. This wasn't a moral story, it was a math story, and in every transition the same group wins, those positioned in real assets and scarce stores of value relative to the failing unit. Now hold that thought, because the modern era adds one dangerous accelerant. Technology and financialization allow stage 3 to last longer and grow larger than ever before. The longer it lasts, the bigger the eventual transfer. Let's map the cycle onto the United States without emotion, just structure. Stage 1 for modern America begins mid-20th century. The post-war system, global industrial dominance, and a monetary architecture that anchored trust. Stage 2, massive expansion, highways, institutions, social programs, a growing middle class, global leadership, funded by genuine productivity at first. Then stage 3, overreach and debasement. This is where the turning point becomes visible historically. When constraints loosen, when money becomes more elastic, when deficits become structural, when the currency becomes primarily a confidence instrument rather than a hard constraint. With fiat flexibility, the system can survive longer than Rome ever could because credit can be created on demand. But survival isn't health, it's delay. And delay has a price: larger debt, larger asset bubbles, larger dependence on confidence. Which brings us to stage 4, desperate resource acquisition. This stage is often misunderstood because it looks like strength. It looks like power projection. But economically, it behaves like a patch. When an empire senses that its financial base is hollowing, it seeks collateral. Real assets, energy, minerals, supply chains, choke points. Venezuela, in this framework, is not a random target. It's a symbol because it represents the most direct, globally priced strategic commodity, oil. And oil is not just energy. It's currency plumbing. It's trade leverage. It's inflation control. It's industrial survival. If you accept even a hypothetical that a major power would take direct control of massive reserves through force or regime change, it screams stage 4 logic. Acquire collateral to stabilize an increasingly unstable system. But here's the brutal truth. Stage 4 doesn't solve the problem. Stage 4 buys time. It buys time by injecting real assets into the system, by creating revenue channels, by anchoring trade, by controlling supply. It's a patch on a deeper imbalance, spending commitments outpacing productive base. So the empire may grab resources, but the internal math continues to deteriorate. And while the empire looks outward, Stage 5 accelerates inward. Loss of confidence. You can see Stage 5 in 3 places: everyday prices, capital migration, and reserve diversification. When people feel their money buys less, they begin seeking shelter. When wealthy individuals move jurisdictions, they are voting with capital. When foreign governments diversify reserves, they are voting with policy. These votes don't happen all at once. They happen gradually, then suddenly. And then comes the trap. Stage 6, fiscal dominance. This is where the system becomes sensitive to interest rates at a scale that changes everything. When the debt burden is enormous, raising rates to fight inflation becomes politically and mathematically explosive because it increases interest costs and can destabilize the sovereign balance sheet. But keeping rates low while inflation rises destroys purchasing power and can fracture trust. That's the no-exit corridor. And that corridor is where the biggest wealth transfers are born, because it forces the system to choose a hidden tax: currency debasement through inflation or stealth repression through negative real rates. In that environment, the average person loses quietly while the asset-owning class wins structurally. This is why people call it a transfer rather than a collapse. It is not the end of wealth. It is the redistribution of wealth from savings to scarcity, from wages to assets, from late movers to early movers. Now, does this mean doom tomorrow? No. The British pound took decades to fully lose reserve status. Transitions can be slow and painful. But slow does not mean safe, because slow erosion is how the majority gets trapped. The biggest mistake people make is waiting for a single dramatic moment. But the moment often comes after the transfer already began. What matters is not predicting a date. What matters is knowing the stage and watching the indicators that confirm the stage is changing. So next, we identify the indicators that tell you whether Stage 4 is intensifying and whether Stage 5 is accelerating. Forget headlines. Watch the indicators that survive spin. Indicator 1, the interest burden trend, not the debt number. Debt can grow in stable systems if interest costs remain manageable. But when interest expense grows faster than revenue, it becomes a self-feeding mechanism. This is where fiscal dominance begins forming because the state becomes forced to prioritize servicing over everything else. Indicator 2, real rates. Real rates are nominal rates minus inflation. When real rates stay negative for long periods, it's a signal that the system is choosing debasement as policy, even if it doesn't admit it. Negative real rates are a stealth tax on savers and a subsidy to debtors. This accelerates the transfer from cash to hard assets. Indicator 3, capital migration patterns. When high net worth individuals and businesses relocate en masse, it's not because of vibes. It's because they see policy risk, taxation risk, currency risk, or social instability risk ahead of the curve. You don't need exact numbers to get the message. Increasing migration is a Stage 5 marker. Indicator 4, reserve diversification and trade settlement changes. When countries settle more trade outside the dominant currency, it's a direct reduction in structural demand for that currency. This often moves slowly, then accelerates after confidence shocks. Indicator 5, commodity and strategic metal behavior relative to currency. Crude oil, gold, silver, copper, uranium. When these assets begin moving in ways that reflect currency weakness rather than simple supply-demand cycles, it's a sign of monetary stress, not just commodity cycles. Indicator 6, policy language. When leaders start framing resource control, supply chains, and strategic materials as national security priorities, you're watching Stage 4 intensify in real time, because national security becomes the marketing wrapper for asset acquisition logic. Indicator 7, domestic cohesion indicators, polarization, trust in institutions, and the widening gap between asset owners and wage earners. Stage 5 is not just financial, it's social, because currency erosion breaks the psychological contract between citizens and state. When the middle class realizes the rules no longer protect purchasing power, cohesion fractures. And fractured cohesion makes the policy response more extreme, which further accelerates capital flight. That's the feedback loop that pushes Stage 5 into Stage 6. Once fiscal dominance arrives, the range of outcomes narrows. Something has to give. Inflation, austerity, default, repression, or combination. History shows most systems choose the path that preserves short-term stability for institutions, even if it erodes citizens' purchasing power long-term. That's why the transfer is so consistent across empires. It's not a conspiracy, it's incentive structures. Those closest to money creation benefit first. Those farthest from it pay last, which means the average person who holds savings in the currency takes the hit, while the holders of scarce real assets reprice upward as the unit weakens. So the question becomes, what survives? And how do people position intelligently without panic, without gambling, and without becoming a hostage to fear? If you want the truth, it's simple and uncomfortable. Most people lose not because they are lazy, but because they store their lives in the wrong measuring stick. When the measuring stick shrinks, their life shrinks with it. History shows 3 categories tend to preserve wealth across empire resets. Category 1, scarce stores of value that are not someone else's liability. Gold and silver are classic examples because they survive monetary regime changes precisely because they are not promises. They can be volatile, yes, but in resets, they are not zeroed by default in the way claims can be. Category 2, productive real assets. Land that produces food, energy assets, infrastructure tied to real demand. Companies with pricing power and real cash flows that can adjust to inflation. Skills-based businesses that solve essential problems. These aren't sexy, but they are durable. Category 3, skills and optionality. This one is underrated. A currency reset can destroy savings, but it can't erase competence. If you can build, fix, diagnose, create, ship, protect, or operate essential systems, your earning power survives transitions. Optionality means mobility, legal structure flexibility, diversified income sources, and networks outside a single failing system. This is why capital migration increases in stage 5. The wealthy are purchasing optionality. Now let's address the psychology, because this is where most people get trapped. They hear collapse and imagine instant chaos. That's not how it usually happens. The typical path is slow erosion with occasional shocks. Those shocks are designed by the system, intentionally or not, to flush weak hands, to restore temporary confidence, to buy time. This is why you see cycles of fear and relief, volatility and stabilization. The transfer happens during the lull, not the panic. It happens when people convince themselves it's fine now. Meanwhile, structural inflation, repression, or debasement continues quietly. So the correct mindset is not panic, it's allocation, it's risk management. It's making sure you are not 100% exposed to one unit, one jurisdiction, one policy regime. That does not require extreme behavior. It requires adult behavior. Diversification is not a slogan in late-stage cycles. It's survival design. Now, how does Venezuela fit into this survival framework? Because it symbolizes something, the return of physicality. When money loses integrity, the world returns to physical assets, energy, metals, food, water, infrastructure, supply chain choke points. This is why Stage 4 appears across history as resource acquisition and control, often with moral narratives layered on top. If you see a world shifting toward physical control, your strategy should not be more paper promises. It should be a balanced exposure to what remains valuable when promises weaken. And that brings us to the final section, what happens next, and how the story usually ends when Stage 4 becomes openly visible. Here's the hard part. The end game is not a single outcome, it's a range. But the range has a common direction, a repricing of real assets relative to the currency, and a loss of purchasing power for those trapped entirely inside the system, S claims. In one scenario, the transition is slow, the currency's global role erodes gradually, inflation runs higher than official comfort, real rates stay suppressed, and the system manages the decline through financial repression. This can last years, even decades, but it is a transfer nonetheless. In another scenario, confidence breaks faster. A geopolitical shock, an energy crisis, a sudden policy move, a bond market event, a reserve shift, or a domestic fracture accelerates Stage 5 into Stage 6 quickly. Then you see sharper volatility, more aggressive controls, more explicit resource policies, and faster repricing. In either scenario, the lesson is identical. If you wait for certainty, you will arrive after the transfer has already happened. Certainty is expensive and usually only available after the door closes. That's why empire cycles keep catching populations off guard. Not because the pattern is hidden, but because the pattern feels impossible until it's irreversible. Think about the British pound. Reserve status did not vanish in a week. It weakened through wars, debt and devaluations, then ceded dominance as the world's balance sheet shifted. Ordinary citizens felt it later in purchasing power and living standards. The winners were not prophets. They were people who simply refused to keep all their wealth inside a weakening unit. Now bring it back to the present. If the Venezuela shock is real, it is not the beginning. It is a symptom. It is Stage 4 behavior becoming visible. And visible Stage 4 usually means Stage 5 is not far behind, because the act of grabbing real assets signals that the system's internal integrity is no longer enough to sustain confidence without collateral. That's the message. And it's why this video matters beyond one country, one operation, one headline. This is about the cycle. And the cycle is absolute because it's driven by incentives, debt math, and human nature, not ideology. Your job is not to predict the exact day the system resets. Your job is to stop being the person who stores their life in the most fragile measuring stick available, and to become the person who can survive a regime change with dignity, diversified, skilled, mobile enough, and positioned in real value. This isn't fear. This is literacy. If this framework changed how you see the world, subscribe. Because in the next video, I'm going to do two things. First, I'll show you the 3 most reliable stage shift signals that historically mark the move from loss of confidence into fiscal dominance. Second, I'll break down the assets and strategies that repeatedly preserve purchasing power across Rome, the Dutch transition, and the fall of sterling. Without hype, without fantasy, just evidence and logic. Music drops, final line calm. The greatest wealth transfers don't happen when people are screaming. They happen when people are still asleep. And the question is simple: will you recognize the cycle while you still have choices?